Welcome to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy.
Hi, everyone.
Sarah and I spent the last 25 years working with leaders across the U.S. and around the world to build trauma-informed workplaces and to transform service delivery for nonprofit, government, and for-profit organizations that exist for the purpose of helping people. In this podcast, we're going to share our insights, experiences, and knowledge in the hope of inspiring leaders and other professionals to put these ideas into practice.
Today, we're going to address some ideas and some skills that all of us probably should have learned in elementary school, but that many of us didn't learn about. Mainly, what do you do when you get into an interpersonal conflict?
Yeah, many of us are just unable to manage disagreements about a process or getting a task done, or something that should be organized at work, that should be pretty straightforward and fairly simple to figure out, because they're called task conflicts. And they're about finding the best course of action, seeing multiple solutions and weighing each one as to which one's going to work the best, focusing on the work itself, and appreciating different points of view. That's what task conflict about. And we all should be pretty good at managing task conflicts.
But task conflict sometimes devolves into interpersonal conflict. And most of us aren't very good at managing that tricky, inflammatory, challenging conflict. And they can arise with our partners, our friends, our children, our family members. But we really focus in our work with creating presence on what happens when they show up at work. And there are lots of distressing feelings that get related to perceptions of disrespect, right? That's one of the clues that you've moved from task conflict to interpersonal conflict. And there are often feelings related to perceived violations of emotional or social safety, intense feelings about differences of communication style. And, we also can recognize it because there are experiences of territoriality or sometimes unintentional, sometimes intentional threats to our sense of identity. When we feel that, we know that we are engaged in interpersonal conflict rather than task conflict.
It can really be shocking how quickly a conflict can escalate without actually understanding at all how our body and brain respond to any kind of conflict-laden situation. I mean, the reality is we evolved to respond quickly to any situation of danger. But the original situations of danger in our evolutionary history were lions, tigers, and bears,
Oh
not,
my.
yeah, not other human beings. And yeah, that really turns out to be a huge problem.
And, we don't really have a lot of that to worry about in our current, iteration of human existence. But there are lots of other kinds of stressors and dangers, and they are human beings.
Yeah, exactly. Even so, when we get angry or upset with somebody at home or at work, even though there is no actual physical danger, our alarm system goes from 0 to 10 really amazingly quickly. It's amazing how fast you can offend somebody else without even intending to,
Yeah,
and
and I
without
think
even thinking about it.
yeah, we like to spend some time in our podcast, Sandy, talking about, the biological and psychological processes that kind of underpin these issues that come up in organizations. And, I think it's helpful to recognize that, based on our personal lived experiences, all of us as humans, we're vulnerable to being activated by a host of different things. Things that may not cause the same response in other people. I think about, my wife, one of her triggers is being late. And I know that that comes from her lived experience in the army, right? If one person was late, the whole group had to do push-ups, and that is deeply ingrained, right? She doesn't have to, nobody does push-ups anymore in our house. I can assure you there are no push-ups. But for her, that has really stuck with her. For me, it's encountering entitlement. I know, being disregarded or overlooked is an experience that I've had in my early career that I think still really lives with me. And so when people, engage with me in a way that I experience as entitled, that gets triggered. Lateness is fine with me, but entitlement, not so much. And I think, when we go back to some of the early research that, predates this work and is the foundation for this work for us now, it started with recognizing the experiences of veterans who had what was called shell shock and their hypersensitivity to loud noises, right, which was replicated in their experience of war, but then they were so sensitive to it even when they were home in a safe environment.
Yeah, exactly. I think what people fail to realize really is what's going on inside that biological piece, which is so important, that there are really two major parts of our nervous system that keep us in balance. And one is the sympathetic nervous system, and the other is the parasympathetic nervous system. And this runs from our brain all the way down to the tippy of our toes. They're everywhere through our whole body. And when we're upset in any way, when there is the experience of danger or violation of boundaries, anything like that, that in our evolutionary history was important, may not be so important now, right? But nonetheless, our sympathetic nervous system goes all the way on very quickly. So our heart races and our blood pressure goes up. And really important, our good quality conscious thinking plummets. It goes down really, because you don't need that. If you're running from a lion, you don't really need to think about it. So the blood shunts away from your GI system, digesting, and goes into your muscles so that you can run or you can fight if you have to. And once this system is activated by something or by somebody, within, get this now, 12 milliseconds, your whole body is activated. I don't even register what a millisecond is. So within 12 milliseconds, your whole body is activated. And then it takes twice as long before information gets out to your conscious thinking minds. That's how easily we can make things way worse without actually consciously intending to do so. Just think about somebody who has a gun in their hand.
Yeah, you're describing the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn response, and why it's automatic, right? We're not making rational decisions, but reacting with a biological impulse. And in our work settings, this is most likely to get activated by the words or actions of other people. And then how we react can escalate a situation to becoming dangerous. Not just physically dangerous, right? We don't often see people acting out physically with aggression in the workplace, although it certainly does happen. But socially, emotionally, or even morally, those are some of the ways that we end up behaving that really negatively impact safety.
Exactly. It's now the other part of our central nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system. It's also called rest and digest. So you have fight, flight, freeze, rest, and digest. Because it has the opposite effect to the sympathetic nervous system. It calms things down. Not our emotions, but really importantly, our physiology. So your blood pressure comes down, your heart rate comes down, you start feeling more calm inside. I mean, that's really important to get back into balance because they're supposed to work when we're okay in a balancing way. It's called homeostasis.
One of the skills that we teach our sites in creating presence is a brain regulation skill called the emotional volume plan. And it's really important to have them because it's a way of deliberately activating our parasympathetic nervous systems.
Yeah, why don't you describe what an emotional volume plan is and how to make one?
Okay, because I have to use one all the time in lots of different places in my life. Um, so an emotional volume plan it's actually a process of examination, self-examination, in order to recognize your emotions, triggers, your body, signs, and then ways to regulate it. So here's what that looks like. We we ask people to think about which emotions are most difficult for them to manage. And, most of the time people will say, oh, well, it's anger. I get angry really easily. And that may be true. But when we're doing this with groups and organizations, we also ask people to look underneath anger, because often the emotion that's, sort of being demonstrated isn't exactly the emotion that's being felt or experienced. And often what puts people in the position of feeling emotionally overwhelmed is helplessness, hopelessness, shame. Those three show up a lot. And so we ask people to really think about that. And for me, I have discovered that helplessness is the emotion that's most painful and difficult. It's the one that really dysregulates me and overwhelms me. And that's really helpful to know. The second question is to ask, what situations trigger that emotion? So if it's helplessness or hopelessness or shame. And I know for me, I've had to really grapple with understanding that what triggers the sense of helplessness for me is feeling like I have to choose between really equally important things. And a good example of that, in a previous work setting that I had, was where I was the only person in my program who was authorized to supervise family visits with foster children. And so I had, always the policy in place of scheduling those visits in the morning and, kind of trying to ensure that they would happen because for the kids that I was caring for, it's really important. And many, many times what would happen, is because biological parents and families were traveling from a long distance, they would have a hard time getting there and getting there on time. And so there were a number of times when I, it would hit, the clock would hit 4:45. I leave at 5 o'clock. I have to pick my own kids up from daycare. There's a rule at the daycare that if you are more than 10 minutes late for pickup, you get charged by the minute. And if you are late more than 10 minutes 3 times, you're out. So at 4:45, the family would show up. And here I would find myself in this situation of telling them, I'm sorry, you can't have a visit after you've traveled for 2 hours, and taken every bus, train, and, taxi that you could, or I would have to risk my own children's daycare placement. And
Um,
that was the kind of situation that would put me into a tailspin. I loved this job. I loved the work. I hated that so much. And
oh, absolutely.
it was the kind of thing that put me, over the edge all the time. And no matter which choice I made, and it depended on the situation, I felt, it was something, it was always the wrong choice, right?
Yeah, lose, lose.
It was a total lose-lose. So those kinds of situations where I feel like I have to choose between two things that are impossible to choose between, that lose, those are really a trigger for me for that feeling of helplessness.
Yeah. So let's talk about what other triggers conflict in the workplace.
Yeah.
These days, so many people are working under conditions of chronic stress.
Yeah.
And quite often, bad things happen to us as a result of this normal biological fight flight thing because our perception's narrow, the context of information is lost, kind of. So you would have been hyper aroused as a result of trying to figure out what in the world can you do to make this work, and I didn't know what to do. I mean, I would imagine that would have been impossible. Other things that happen is this increase in um, information coming from the top, going down through the hierarchy, but not having any feedback loops. So a stressed leader becomes more controlling, more authoritarian, like we were talking about earlier. And instead, the persons below don't have any opportunity to say, hey, whoa, wait a minute, this isn't going to work. So complex team behaviors just go down the tubes, and everybody's gossiping and being nasty to each other because everybody's so stressed out, and this can go on and on and on. You want to talk about signs we should all look out for?
Yeah, I think, organizational conflicts that run on for years without really changing. That's one of the signs that we need to look for. A general attitude that problems will never be resolved. So kind of that hopelessness or helplessness that I was talking about. Private complaining with very little attempt to fix the problem, right? So when people are
Wham, wham,
talking
wham,
more,
wham.
yeah, about it.
Yeah.
Staff showing very little interest in working on common goals, but spending significant time and energy protecting themselves or their own interests, or, kind of people disengaging. That's another sign. Another thing we see is secrecy or law and order approach. So I think, I've seen this in some of our organizations when I'm coaching. And a really good example that stands out to me when there is this conflict and when people are not using their emotional volume plans, right? When they are not tuning into, like, what is the emotion? What are the triggers that are likely to happen for me? What happens to my body? And then what can I do to take the volume down, right? They're operating from the amygdala. They're operating with, from the sympathetic nervous system. When we are in that mode, which happens frequently, and especially for leaders, we see, they make decisions that don't take into account full complexity. That idea of vertical communication structures, I saw this recently with an organization that I'm working with. There was a budget problem. And the leaders and the board decided they were going to close a program. And this was a really big deal. And so what started happening was meetings were getting canceled. And Anything that had to do with the program closure or the changes were being sent by email. And this is really that like one-way communication. So information was coming out, but there was no opportunity for the people receiving this news to process it or to, have any opportunity to ask questions or respond in any way. And then one of the people on our engagement and enactment team was sharing this, and she said, I suggested that we call a staff meeting just to give people a place to process this. And that really shifted the tone and shifted people's experience and created some real re-engagement. And it wasn't, a session that beat up on the leaders or, I think everyone worries it's going to devolve into, something awful and painful and ugly. So they avoid it. But
Yeah.
it really actually created some containment.
Well, this really is a good example of how important it is to understand organizations as living beings, as having an organizational body. Because in that example, what is not being allowed is a sense of bereavement, of loss. A program is closing. That means something for everybody. And an organization, just like a family or an individual, have to be able to grieve. And there's really a very high price for failing to deal with these kinds of circumstances, for failing to recognize how important it is to address a conflict, because conflict is the alarm bell of what I've called the social immune system. So it's like when you get a symptom in your body, you get a pain, right? Or a growth that shouldn't be there on your skin, or it's usually pain of some sort in your body. Your body is telling you that there's something wrong that needs attention. It's the alarm bell, right? So, but if you ignore it, it's probably going to get worse. It's not going to get better. And it's the same in the organizational body. Conflict that isn't surface festers. Conflict that is not resolved is going to escalate. It's not magically going to go away and disappear. And how you know that's happening, particularly if you're in a management or supervisory position, is what you'll see. It doesn't just boom turn out as violence. It starts with much more low level hurtful things happening. So disrespect, shaming, humiliating people, blaming. Then it can escalate to hate speech, to social splitting, to, the social workers aren't talking to the doctors, or the nurses won't have anything to do with the quality assurance people. I just hate them, right? I mean, all that kind of splitting is occurring. And then if that is not addressed, then you're more likely to see the emergence of real threats and really threatening behavior, and then low-level violence. And if it's still not addressed, that's when you get these situations where really bad things happen, where you get high-level violence it can happen in any organization, because conflict is normal among people. So there's always going to be conflict, and we're not very good at addressing it.
No, and I think, even though the work that we're doing in creating presence is focused on organizations, agencies, companies that are, their whole purpose is to help people, there's something still sort of taboo about talking about emotions. And so, we talked in our last podcast about the presence meeting and the importance of, naming our emotions and being aware of our emotions. And the emotional volume plan is an extension of that, right? So many of our brain regulation skills, our communication skills are about reinforcing the recognition of emotions as part of normal human existence. And often, we are trying to minimize our emotions or contain them, and we're afraid of other people's emotions. But having these skills and tools really gives us the opportunity to lean into emotions as a powerful force, right? We can actually, if we're attuned to our emotions and we're attuned to our own bodies, and we know what we need to do in order to activate that parasympathetic nervous system, right? To bring our thinking brains back online, then we as leaders are not only role modeling that for the people that we're leading, we're also putting ourselves in a position where we can make better decisions.
Absolutely. And it's so liberating for people to understand this. I teach all of my students in my classes, they have to do an emotional management plan. And the feedback I get is so positive. And recently I had an experience with a friend who was in a very difficult situation with another family member that was really frustrating her. And she's someone who gets angry, 0 to 10, very fast. And just teaching her about this, what's going on, enabled her to be in this situation, deal with the situation, and not go to 10, to just be able to stay calm. It was wonderful to see that happen.
Well, and I think it's so helpful to frame it as, just part of our biology. And to remember that when we are coming up with strategies to bring our to activate that parasympathetic nervous system, we want to do things that are physical. We want to do things like deep breathing or, squeezing our hands or muscle relaxation, that being connecting our physical bodies to our emotions and using that for regulation, so helpful. We want to thank you for listening to Creating Presence. Coming up after the break, we'll talk more about the importance of emotion regulation and conflict. And we'll be back right after these messages.
If you want to develop a trauma-responsive culture within your organization, your leaders must be able to be knowledgeable and possess the skills to create positive change. Creating Presence, developed by world-renowned Dr. Sandra Bloom, offers an online training and coaching process that will help leaders become capable to cultivate a safe, productive, and values-aligned environment for your staff and clients. For more information, go to www.creatingpresence.net. Creating Presence is managed by Lakeside, your resource for trauma-responsive care.
Welcome back to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy. And today we're going to continue our discussion about conflict in the context of trauma-informed practice, because it tends to be a barrier to creating healthy, high-functioning teams, which is so critical if we're going to be successfully help people who have experienced trauma. Sometimes the problem with conflict really in organizations is that it just goes on and on. It never gets resolved, and it lingers as bad feelings between people or groups of people. And sometimes the problem is that it goes underground because people really avoid dealing with the conflict.
Yeah. When I do coaching with our Creating Presence teams, and I say, we're going to talk about conflict and conflict management, people often freak out because, our tendency for many of us is to avoid it. But I find that it's really helpful to just start with some assumptions. And one of them is that high performance and group cohesion among people who have different areas of expertise or different strengths, different working styles, or even different visions, it unfolds over time. And I also think it's important to assume that there are different groups operating at different phases in an organization at any point in time. So there are some groups that are forming, right? Some that are storming, some that are norming, and some that are performing. And that's probably familiar terminology for leaders who, kind of understand the phases of group development. And in creating presence, we have skills that really are targeted for each of those specific phases. But we are going to focus a lot on storming, since that's often where we find the most conflict. Right? Another assumption that I think is helpful to start with is that there are going to be misunderstandings or interpersonal missteps among team members, and that those might be connected to people's previous experiences, their identity, intersectionality, their personality or communication styles, and exposure to adversity, trauma, and stress, sometimes through exposure to systems of oppression. And then the last assumption, I think, is that, these experiences require moving through some discomfort. Discomfort is part of that process towards resolution or growth. And the process is supported by creating norms and agreements about how we communicate and what we do when we encounter conflict.
You reminded me of something too. I mean, it is important, particularly in an environment that exists now where there's so much turnover and such rapid turnover. So a person leaves one job because they were unhappy with it and comes to the new job, and they can't erase their memory of what happened. So they're bringing all that stuff into the new position. So it's really hard on both the new person and the people that are welcoming the new person, is that all of that baggage that they've had from the past, it doesn't just disappear. So there has to be some way of resolving and having clarity about those norms that you were referring to, about how do we communicate and how do we manage conflict. And I think it's important, we mentioned this earlier, but let's emphasize it again, that there are two different kinds of conflicts mainly, right? Task conflicts about finding the right course of action, looking for multiple solutions, weighing them, figuring out what's going to work best, and in the process, appreciating other points of view that add to the conversation. Those are healthy conflicts that need to happen in any organization if you're going to do anything innovative.
Well, and as leaders, we actually want to encourage that, right? We want to create an environment where task conflict is viewed as positive and worthwhile.
Exactly. And that won't happen if there's a lot of interpersonal conflict, right? If people don't feel safe, if they feel like they're going to get blamed or shamed or humiliated, they won't engage in the kind of really good task conflict if there's too much interpersonal conflict. So those are very interrelated, and really important. One of the big problems, I think, that haunts every level of our society everywhere is the notion of win-lose as the only possible outcome of any conflict. So for many centuries, our society has focused on intense competition where one party wins and the other loses. It's either victory or defeat. So all of our sporting events revolve around this notion. And of course, this kind of thinking then becomes a prototype for economics, for politics, for international relationships, and unfortunately, even for close interpersonal relationships at home and at work. So it really is time that we all move toward a different way of deciding a conflict where everybody participates and no one loses, at least not more than anybody else.
And often when we are working on a project, and good task conflict should be happening, but it's devolved into interpersonal conflict, it's because there've been some relational failures, communication mishaps. And successful communication really requires the appropriate choice of language. And so for leaders, this requires self-awareness, appropriate choice of nonverbals. This requires even more self-awareness, and the appreciation of someone's power. And this requires a lot of self-awareness. And
Right.
so,
Self-awareness,
yeah,
self-awareness,
the takeaway
self-awareness.
here for leaders is, when you're interested in managing conflict effectively, self-awareness is kind of step one.
Really important. And the prototype, we all need to take responsibility for. Our prototypes for that, whatever position we're in, are our experiences and our own childhoods. So you can't get away from that whole issue of what happens to you as a result of adverse childhood experiences. In creating presence and focusing on communication skills, we offer some really practical steps for developing that self-awareness. We ask people to figure out their own conflict modes, the one you fall into automatically, not the one you really think about, but the one that happens automatically. And these people, Thomas Kilmann categories, they're called, of determining what our own conflict mode is. So there is competing, right? The person who only focuses on winning, compromising, the person that focuses on each person having to give something up, avoiding, just not getting involved, not participating at all, saying nothing, right? Contributing nothing to the group process.
We call it taking your ball and going home.
Yeah, exactly.
Metaphor.
Yes. Accommodating, giving in, but really you're still really resentful. And maybe even you undermine what the group is aiming for because really you don't really agree. And then there's collaborating. This is the one that is actually most effective at maintaining relationships because it focuses on finding win-win solutions where everybody comes out of the situation not feeling abysmal.
Yeah, and I think, if your natural mode is not collaborating, and I think for most of us, that is probably the case. We are not socialized, at least not in this country, towards collaborating around conflict. Our modes are more likely to be one of these others. So, and I say that as someone whose mode is not naturally collaborating. So I say that with a lot of love and compassion. We need to learn how to do that. And so we teach our implementing sites to use specific language. So this is a communication skill that we work with to try to promote that more collaborating conflict mode. And it's called the language of interest.
Yeah, we tend to rely on two communication styles when we're negotiating a conflict. So, and it starts usually in childhood. No TV tonight because you've not cleaned your room. That's not fair, right? You hear that, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
That's the difference between the language of power and the language of justice. So the language of power usually the intention is to shut down the conversation, right? You're dominating somebody, you use your position, your expertise, or just general force, right? It can be subtle. Let's talk to the principal about that.
Yeah,
right?
if you're a teacher and
Right.
you're like, I'm going to take this even higher.
Even higher,
yeah.
even more power.
Yeah.
Because I said so. This is not up for discussion. This is all the language of power. And the language of justice automatically sets up a dichotomy in which only one person can be right because it's fairness or unfairness. I think you have a story about that.
Yeah, so this is really, back from my days in residential, when we started to challenge the idea of fairness, our little guys and girls were, very stuck, developmentally appropriately, but frustratingly for us in, kind of that moral development phase around fairness. And if somebody wanted the blue crayon and someone else got the blue crayon, that wasn't fair, right? Everything was not fair, not fair, not fair. And so one of my staff coworkers, was going to take the kids shopping and said, we've been struggling with issues of fairness. And so, in order to be fair, we're going to take all of you out to the store. Everyone is going to get 4 pairs of pants, but they will all be size 5. Everyone's going to get 5 large shirts and 2 pairs of shoes, but they will all be size 6, right? And all the kids were like, that's not fair. That's not fair. That's not my size. I don't wear that size. That's not going to fit me. And so we didn't actually do that, but he used the point to demonstrate that like fair doesn't always mean that everyone gets what they like the same thing. Fair actually means that people get what they need. And I think, what happens in organizations is that we get really fixed on, in the language of justice, about this very limited definition of what fairness is. And that's why this language is so unproductive when we're negotiating and when we're in conflict, because it's really limiting.
Right? We're not really focused on what would work out that would be good for everybody. So everybody needs different things. Everybody's needs are different. This is so much about what's going on in our larger social environment in this country right now is constant conflicts that appear unresolvable about how to be just. What is justice? And who's it for? And huge and the power issues enormously important right now. So
the language of interest is where we, what we try to teach people to use instead. So that self-awareness piece, like where are you more likely to focus your language choices? Are you more oriented to using the language of power or the language of justice? And sort of knowing that is part of the building insight. Moving to the language of interest is really about adopting a win-win mindset and finding common ground. And there are some steps. One is, defining what a good outcome is, like what matters to you. And often I think, when we do this in practice, and I talk with individuals, I'll say, so define your win. What is something that's really important to you? And then they'll be like, well, I just want her to stop doing this. And like, we need to expand past that because that's too limiting. But some examples are things like, okay, well, I'll come out of this conversation, we'll agree to a follow-up meeting, or we'll leave with 1 point of agreement, or I'll summarize this person's points and she'll summarize my points, or we'll have 1 action step when we leave, right? Like really thinking about what is a potential win. And then
even if it's a small win.
Even if it's
right.
Exactly. Even if it's a small win, it's about kind of getting past that block, because what keeps conflict in motion for decades, which we've seen in organizations, right, is that there's this barrier and there's no movement and everyone is really stuck. So those small wins are, part of breaking that pattern. But then we also have to recognize the emotions, like what's bringing up strong feelings that's keeping people in this pattern? What are they afraid of losing? What are their priorities? What's most important to them? And then finally thinking about what is it that we can get to where both people can feel like they've won. So that's one of the skills. And another one is that's really important in this process is building consensus. So let's talk a little bit more about that.
Well, building consensus is so critically important and not easy for people to do. And the best model for it actually goes back in time to the Native Americans who were here when all the founding fathers came over. And they called themselves the Iroquois Confederation, and 5 and then 6 tribes got together because they wanted to figure out a way to stop killing each other. And so they created the Great Law of Peace, they called it, which basically was the model for our Constitution. And the format that they used is so interesting because it was based on all of these tribes having to build consensus when a major issue came up so that it wouldn't end up in a major conflict that would end up pretty bloody. So they created this whole system of how gradually you build consensus by active discussing exactly what you've been talking about, in really getting farther along, finding some place where we can have some kind of unity, and it provides a system really of checks and balances through public debate and building consensus. If we have time, we can talk about it. And the word consensus comes from the Latin, and it means feeling together. So feelings have to be brought in. They have to be honored. It's not a strictly analytical, data-driven issue. It really, you have to, how are people feeling about this? That's what becomes so critical.
Well, and it's in our practice of building consensus with organizations, I think we start by clearing up some misconceptions about it, because I think the reason that a lot of leaders are like, oh, I don't have time for that, and 2, like, I can't get everybody to agree. Like, are you kidding? That's never going to happen. The one constant in my organization is that not everyone is happy, right? Like, I can never make everyone happy. And so defining the consensus process, not as like making everyone happy, but going back to that conflict mode of collaboration, like everybody participates, and at the end, everybody can live with the decision.
Right.
And we don't finish deciding until we've navigated through all of the different pieces and gotten to a place where everyone can live with it. Not that everyone's like, yay, this is perfect, but no one is saying like, I have to object or stand in the way. And that does take a lot of time. And it's also not appropriate for every single decision, right? I think that's important to clarify too. Like, there are some things that are not appropriate for consensus. But when we have decisions to make that are going to be best executed by people who have had a voice in shaping them, that's when we want to use that consensus building skill. So there are some rules to the consensus building process, and what it starts with is, right, everybody can live with it. Like, that's kind of the first primary rule. The second is that the group's well-being is paramount, right? So and it's important to review this, because I think what we tend to do, especially if our conflict mode is competing, is to sort of take a position of I win, you lose. But in building consensus, the group itself has to win. We have to change that orientation. And so you can only block something, or you can only, sort of stand in the way of a process moving forward if the outcome is going to be detrimental to the whole group, not just for you. The third is to question assumptions. So we welcome asking clarifying questions. And one of the things I find is a language thing is that if you're facilitating a building consensus process, anytime someone asks a question or shares an observation, it's really helpful to say thank you, to acknowledge their contribution. That's what helps people feel safe in raising issues. We also need to assume good faith, and this can be hard too, but to do this work well, we want to, remind people that that is part of the process, that to assume the good faith of other people, and to speak in turn, right? To respect the right of other people to contribute and to trust that you will be given time. And often we do this by going around one by one in a circle and literally giving everyone a turn to speak or contribute.
And when that happens, people only are responsible for speaking for themselves, right? Only not for other people, but just this is what I think. This is what I believe. A really hard part of this process is relinquishing one's own ownership of ideas. So you have to see your ideas as gifts to the group. And then if they're really effective, then they won't be ascribed to you anymore. They will be part, and that is real. I've had to do that a gazillion times. That one is really hard to do.
Yeah.
If someone has information or opinion or a concern, they have to speak up as gift to the group. And, we have to also respect people's choice to remain silent. We want conflict. It's desirable. In going through this process, we all have to understand will improve the group process and help us reach our goals. But you got to know what the process is. It's everybody's responsibility to know what it is and how to participate and, what it means and what it doesn't mean, all these guidelines that we're talking about. And the final one is from Saint Mick of Stone, i.e. the Rolling Stones. You can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, you just might find you get what you need. It means that we as a group come together to cooperate and to negotiate until we find a win-win consensus, not a win-lose vote. That we actually as a group see having to get to a win-lose vote as a failure of the group process.
Right.
And that is hard for us in our culture to get to that place. That is a huge, huge shift for people to make. And it's what's not happening right now anywhere in the country. It's not happening in Congress. It's not happening anywhere. And part of why, we get stuck as a society in this polarized domain is because we're not doing this process. We're not building consensus.
Yeah. And it is really interesting too. I did recently have an opportunity to do a building consensus process with an organization and a group. And at the end, they talked about feeling like it had not really gone as well as they wanted it to. And I asked some questions about what happened, and there were two things. One is the person who typically leads the team took control of facilitating and sort of, I think just by nature of her title as the manager, and they said, it kind of devolved in the same way that all of our meetings do. And it gave us the opportunity to talk about reenactment. I was like, okay, this pattern is happening. Maybe someone else facilitates. Let's try this again and just give someone else the clipboard to take the notes. And it was actually much more successful. So some other things, that happen in team dynamics can often be uncovered in this process. So we want to thank you so much for listening to Creating Presence. Join us again next week when Sandy and I will talk more about what it means to lead in a trauma-informed organization. You can reach us at creatingpresence.net or voiceamerica.com. We'll see you next week.